Welcome to Ecclesia Principles, a biblical strategy for believers to engage in God's design for government with Ray Eppard.
Hello, glad you could join us again today. We're going to finish up today on talking about separation of powers. And in this, just a very quick little bit of review. What we've talked about is that the highest level of separation of powers is the separation of the jurisdictions that God has established, and that they are to all remain intact, that there needs to be a balance, that neither one overrides the other and gets things out of kilter. Because as soon as it gets out of kilter, what you end up having is tyranny. And it ultimately will always end in negativity. And when I say negativity, I'm talking about bad things, destruction, suffering. It will always move to that direction. Now, when I'm saying that, I actually had a conversation with one of my sons a little while back, and I forget how we got on the subject, but we were talking about some things, and it was some financial. We were listening to a financial podcast together, and this one person was saying some kind of outlandish things, and we got discussing that. And part of what I told him, I said, well, here's the thing. I said, people like that, I said, they understand finance, but they realize where it's going, and they condense it, and it makes it very frequently sound like it's going to happen tomorrow. It's going to happen next week, where it's going to take time. It'll take a long time for it to get there. And if you would, and I used the example, I said back in the early 60s, I said there were people that talked about what would happen to society when we removed the Bible from school. There were people that talked about what would happen to society when we removed prayer from school. Now, the thing of it is for years, people looked at it and go, no, that's not going to happen. But if you look back to that point in time and where we are now, which is basically 60 years later, the things that those people said would happen to our culture has happened. It's happened. And just within a society that has significant size to it, like ours does, it takes time for seeds to produce fruit. It takes time to reap what you sow. And in the meantime, we had some people working against it, which slowed it up, which is fine with me. We need to work against everything that is detrimental to our nation and to our families and to our children. We need to work against all that. And the fact that there were people working against it, it caused it to slow it up. But because we have not yet been able to undo what was done, our society has continued to go downhill. Crime has went up. Violence has went up. The value of life has diminished. All the bad things that they talked about back then that would happen have happened. They have happened. They were right. It just took a while. But by now, people are pretty much ingrained with the idea that it's supposed to be this way. God's not supposed to be in the school. Prayer's not supposed to be in the school. We're not supposed to have that. And unfortunately, that makes it very hard to reverse it. But it still ends up happening over a gradual period of time. Romans 13:1 says, "Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God." You see, each jurisdiction, self-government, family government, civil government, and church government, all of them can get out of kilter. All of them can exceed their God-appointed boundaries and begin to usurp. I mean, I'll just say it, I've seen it in churches. I've seen churches where the leadership of the church usurped the authority of families and individuals, and basically they weren't a cult, but they kind of functioned like a cult, and that the leadership had control of the people. Well, that is a violation of self-government. God didn't institute church government to eliminate self-government. It didn't do it. God didn't do it for that purpose. But, and we've seen all of these jurisdictions, and I want to get into a little bit of what it looks like when each jurisdiction steps out of its boundary. Earlier this week, I did talk a little bit about self-government, so I won't spend as much time on when it gets out of proportion. Self-government, I think, again, the example that I believe is the most fitting is a mob mentality. You know, at that point, the majority rules. That's the thing. That is self-government in charge. And that the founding fathers referenced it as the tyranny of the majority. You see, at that point, 51% of the people could decide that there's this one group of people that have to give half of everything they make to this group. That's majority ruling. No, we have to be under the rule of law. That's why we have a constitution. Republics have to have a governing body of law. And see, everybody that's wanting to remove the Constitution right now, in all honesty, they're wanting to make self-government into a tyranny. Because ultimately, when self-government becomes tyrannical, when it begins to usurp authority over the family, the way they would do that is, we're upset about this, so we're going to destroy all the homes in this neighborhood. We're going to destroy the businesses in these neighborhoods. We're going to hurt that family's income because we are upset. That's the tyranny of a majority, even if it's a small majority in that area at that time. That's the tyranny of the majority. That is not to be allowed. That is, again, extremely destructive. It is the most obvious in its destructive nature, but all the rest are just as destructive. When the family jurisdiction moves into a tyrannical position, if it is in like a singular family, then the matriarch or the patriarch begins to dictate what the kids do and their families and their spouses and so forth, and it becomes a control at that point, and they have to submit to the head of the family rather than, for this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, cleave to his wife. They're not following that, and the bottom line is that eliminates the freedom and independence, the liberty of that new family. That's on the smaller scale. On a national scale, when family government becomes tyrannical, then you wind up with a monarchy. You wind up with a specific bloodline who ends up ruling the nation and largely does what it wants. In England, they now have a constitutional monarchy. It's not always been that, but basically the monarchy agreed to it so that they could stay in place because the people were going to get rid of them. But they ended up with a compromise and now have a constitutional monarchy. But family government, when it gets out of its boundaries, then it begins to control other people and take the authority of decisions away from either their family or, on the larger scale, the people of that nation, and it becomes tyrannical in that aspect. In regard to civil government becomes tyrannical when it begins to take the authority of self-government and makes the decision. Now, you do not have liberty. You do not have freedom of speech. You do not have freedom of peaceful assembly. They take away the authority of the family. In other words, let's put it this way, that the government is the one that decides about the education of the children and what is right. Parents are not, they don't want parents to have input into that. That is government becoming tyrannical, taking the authority of the parents away. When civil government decides, no, church cannot meet, no, church can't go this direction, church cannot speak out on this subject, then they have shut down the jurisdiction of the church. And at that point, they have become tyrannical. And again, today what we're hearing most of the time is, well, we're trying to help. And as Ronald Reagan often said, scariest words in the English language, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. And that's just as true today as it ever was. And now the thing of it is, let's go to the fourth jurisdiction, and that is the church or faith. And the way it becomes tyrannical, again, just like all the rest, is it begins to usurp the authority of these other jurisdictions. See, as a Christian, you ought to be engaged in government. You ought to be engaged in the process of government. But a church denomination, a church organization, should not run the government. The height of the tyranny of the church was the Holy Roman Empire, where the church, civil government was still in place, but the church pulled all the strings. And by the church, I'm not talking about believers, I'm talking about the hierarchy of the church organization. In this case, it happened to be the Pope. But it wouldn't have to be the Pope. It would be any particular church organization that church tells the government what to do. That is tyranny, and it is not a subjecting of oneself to the authorities that God has established. No, but at the same time, what people in government are telling us, Christians shouldn't get involved. We need to keep that apart. No, church and state needs to be kept apart. You see, the perfect example, when King Charles assumed the throne, his first acts as king were to sign documents giving the Church of Scotland freedom of worship, and that he would not impose any restrictions on them. Why? Because whoever is the monarch of Great Britain, whether it's a king or a queen, is the head of the Church of England. And at that point, they are joined. You see, having those joined is what we don't want. That's wrong. It's having those separate. That is separation of church and state. At that point, Charles should either be king or should be head of the church. Not both. Not both. Shouldn't be both. And that's really the proper understanding of separation of church and state, to where the church doesn't have the position, because God has given, if you would, the civil government the power of the sword, the power to punish. The church should not have the power to punish within society. God didn't give the church that jurisdiction. And if the church moves into that as far as an organization, not believers, I'm not talking about believers being in that position, I'm talking about a church organization being in that position, then it gets into a position of tyranny. And tyranny in any form is resisting the ordinance of God. We need to keep all jurisdictions intact. God bless you. See you again next week.